Welcome, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. Before we get started, I have 4 quick announcements. So the first announcement is that Saturday, August 27th at 2 p.m. at Browers in Fremont, we're going to be getting together for some beers and probably be out on the patio Saturday, August 27th at 2 p.m. The Women's Home Circle will be the second Friday of the month at 7 p.m. and all are welcome to that. We have 5 more slots between now and the end of the year for anybody who would like to give a talk. And the final thing is, we were just talking about it earlier, we won't announce that one. So anyway, without further ado, Stephen, let him introduce his talk. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. So, who are you? That's what this talk is about. If I told you that I had a better chance of understanding you than you do, then I think you might be surprised. In fact, if I told you that anyone else in this room has a better understanding of who you are than you yourself have, then I think you would be surprised. But this is the premise of T.D. Wilson's book, Strangers to Ourselves, and it's the topic of today's sermon. The goal for today is to figure out who you are by the end of the sermon. So, let me explain what T.D. Wilson's main idea is. His main idea is that there are 2 systems in our brain. There's the adaptive unconscious, and then there's a conscious system. So this should sound familiar to you, right? I mean, we've had talks now from Kahneman. We've also talked about Jonathan, Haidt's talk. So we're very familiar with this idea of 2 systems running in the brain that work independently of one another. T.D. Wilson argues that René Descartes actually made 2 errors. Descartes is famous for his distinction between the mind and the body, right? For his mind-body dualism, where he believed that the human mind is something separate from physical laws, somehow it's floating out there above any physical laws. That's one error. But the other error that T.D. Wilson points to is the idea that the mind is the conscious mind, that they're the same thing. That when Descartes talked about the mind, he was talking about the conscious mind and nothing else. But what we know now is that a lot of stuff goes on the unconscious mind. In fact, the vast majority of what goes on in the brain is not conscious to us. Conscious part is just the very, very tip of the iceberg. As a thought experiment, Wilson considers what it would be like to be a person in the way that Descartes explains what a person is. To be only a person who has conscious experiences of the world. And what he argues is that type of person could not function successfully because of so much of what goes on around us is unconscious. His example is, apparently there's a 6th sense called proprioception, which is what allows us to remain balanced. So we're always, pulling in information about where our body is situated in space. We have our, how tense our muscles are. All that information is combined together to keep us balanced when we're standing up. For example, if I lift my left arm right now, unbeknownst to me, I have to actually tilt my body a little bit on the right, or otherwise I'll just go, flopping over. So there's a lot of stuff like that just to keep me balanced in the world. That's completely unconscious. I didn't realize I have to do that. It's just something that we have, built into us. Or let me throw out another example. Another example is everyone right now, just think of the name of your kindergarten teacher. Just, bring it to mind who your kindergarten teacher was. Now, what I want to ask you is, as a computer programmer, I know that writing an algorithm to pull out the name of your kindergarten teacher efficiently is not easy, right? I mean, you'd have to write the right database indexes, you'd have to write the efficient algorithm. It's not a minor thing. But you guys didn't come up with an algorithm at all, right? The name of your kindergarten teacher just popped into your head. It just was apparent in your consciousness, and you don't have to figure out the search algorithm for pulling it out. That's just something that's going on unconsciously behind the scenes. One more example, think of a random number right now. Is anyone thinking of a random number? Throw out your random number. I want to hear a random number. 300, nice, 300. All right, so again, that was a big random number. So again, where did this random number come from? Was it cryptographically strong? Did you come up with a cryptographically strong random number? What algorithm did you use to come up with this random number? I'm guessing you didn't even think of how you did it. It just popped into your head. You had a random number that you could start using. So all of these are examples of, different types of unconscious processes that go on in your head that you just rely on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so now we are all familiar with the idea of the unconscious because of Freud, right? He taught us to think about, there's a lot of stuff that goes on under the surface. But the type of unconscious that Wilson is talking about is very different from the Freudian unconscious. So let me say a little bit about Freud's theory, and then I'll explain how Wilson's theory of the unconscious, what he calls the modern theory of the unconscious, differs from Freud. So Freud believed that there are two types of unconscious thoughts. You can have thoughts that he called preconscious, and all he meant by that are thoughts that aren't in the flashlight of awareness right now. So things like you might not be thinking of the name of your kindergarten teacher at the moment, and so that's a preconscious thought. But it could be easily brought into the spotlight of consciousness if you were just made aware of it. So nothing, fancy there. But the other type of unconscious thought that Freud was concerned about was the repressed unconscious, right? All of those things that you're too afraid to think of at a conscious level. Sort of unconscious aggression toward your mother or your father, all the stuff that shows up in Greek tragedies and Hitchcock films, all that kind of stuff, that's the Freudian unconscious. And the idea there is we just can't deal with it, so we keep it repressed. And the idea in Freud is the reason you go to see a therapist is what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring these unconscious thoughts into consciousness so that you can finally deal with it and you can heal yourself of the problems that you have. Now this is a very different conception of the unconscious than what Wilson wants to call the modern theory. Wilson writes, in contrast, the modern view of the adaptive unconscious is that a lot of the interesting stuff about the human mind, judgments, feelings, motives, occur outside of awareness for reasons of efficiency and not because of repression. So he wants to argue that it's not so much that we're trying to repress this stuff, it's just that this is low-level machinery that we don't have direct access to. In the same way that you cannot become conscious of how your digestive tract processes food or your kidneys process blood, you cannot be conscious of how your adaptive unconscious works. There's no hatch that you can open through introspection to view the adaptive unconscious. It's just, underlying stuff. I mean, I can't think really, really hard and know how my digestive tract right now is processing food I ate earlier today. Nor would I want to, really, if I think about it. But it's just not something that, even if I spent years in therapy, I'd be able to uncover that information. Wilson writes, consider that at any given moment, our five senses are taking in more than 11 million pieces of information. Scientists have determined this number by counting the receptor cells each sense organ has and the nerves that go from these cells to the brain. Our eyes alone receive and send over 10 million signals to our brains every second. Scientists have also tried to determine how many of these signals can be processed consciously at any given point in time by looking at such things as how quickly people can read, consciously detect different flashes of light, and tell apart different kinds of smells. The most liberal estimate is that people can process consciously about, wait for it, here we go, 40 pieces of information per second. So think about it. We take in 11 million pieces of information a second, but we can only process 40 of those pieces of information per second. What happens to the other 10,999,960 pieces of information? It would be terribly wasteful to design a system with such incredible sensory acuity, but very little capacity to use the incoming information. Fortunately, we do make use of a great deal of this information outside of conscious awareness. So again, the idea, we're being bombarded constantly by a ton of information. we've built up, the human body can process all this information, but from all these experiments we do, we use a very, very small fraction of that in our daily conscious life. So where's all that information going? So it's the adaptive unconscious. That's where it's going. And he wants to say the same thing, not only about these sort of low-level processing modules. He wants to say the same thing even about things like emotions, that a lot of the emotions are happening at an unconscious level. He writes, of all the issues I discuss in this book, the idea of unconscious feelings is perhaps the most controversial. In fact, some philosophers and psychologists reject this idea out of hand, arguing that an unconscious feeling is an oxymoron. And, it makes sense given some of the previous things that we've talked about, why people would say that. If you have like the feeling of emotions, where you think an emotion is the conscious experience of the emotion, your heart rate increasing, your palms getting sweaty, then the whole idea of unconscious emotions just doesn't make sense, right? I mean, that's what an emotion is. You have to be able to feel it. What are you talking about when you're talking about unconscious emotions? But what he's saying here is there's a lot of situations where we would say that that person didn't realize that they had the emotion that they had. And he gives an example. This is from a short story by Mary Kerstead, where it's about two cousins who are reminiscing about their childhood summers on the family farm. That sounds nice. When their thoughts turn to Topper, the resident pony. So they're thinking about their pony on their family farm. These are, two cousins. It wasn't until I was about 30 that I realized I had always hated that goddamn pony. He had a mean disposition, and he was fat and spoiled. He would roll on me and then step on my foot before I could get up. And he bit you when you tried to give him lumps of sugar, Kate added. It wasn't until Blake said it that Kate realized that she, too, had always hated Topper. For years, they had been conned into loving him, because children love their pony and their dog and their parents and picnics and the ocean and the lovely chocolate cake. So anyway, the point of this story is these children believe, because of certain cultural requirements, that they should have been loving their pony all this time. But in fact, it took them until they reached the age of 30 to realize that they really didn't like that pony that much. And so this is supposed to be an example of an emotion where they misidentified what the emotion was. They weren't conscious of the right emotion. Okay, so we can accept all this. Yeah, huge amount of processing going on at an unconscious level. And some of that might even involve our emotions and our goals and all that kind of stuff. So that's not at the level of awareness. All this stuff going on, but it seems kind of crazy. I mean, why would the human brain be designed that way? Why would it have both a unconscious part and a conscious part? Why would, who would ever design a system like that? And so what Wilson does here is he appeals to Joseph Ledoux, which we talked about a couple meetings ago. Ledoux is the neuroscientist who did the fear research, right? He did research into the basis of fear. And according to Ledoux, there's actually two pathways that you use to experience fear in the brain. There's the low road and the high road. So according to his theory, if you're walking through a forest and you look down and you see something that looks like a snake, what happens is there's this low road where there's a direct signal from your eyes that goes through directly to the emotional control system that runs very, very quickly, that allows your heart to start racing fast and for you to get ready to go rushing away from the thing that looks like a snake. So that's the low road. It's very efficient, very fast. But the idea is there's also a high road where instead of going directly to causing you to run away, fleeing, it goes to the cortex first, and then it goes to your emotional control system. And the idea with that is that system can be, while it's slower, it can be more deliberative about what's going on. So it can say, hey, wait a minute, that thing has bark and maybe some knotty holes in it. So maybe that's a stick instead of a snake. So maybe I shouldn't go running around in panic in the forest. I can just stay here and have that tasty apple over there and not run away from the thing that I think is a snake. So the idea is that there's two systems in place. There's this unconscious, immediate, fast system that keeps you safe. And they also want to argue that this is evolutionarily older. This is the older system that was in place. And then we have a more sort of thoughtful, deliberative, cognitive system that our emotions run through that allow us to make slower but more complex decisions about what we're interacting with. So that's the basic theory. Okay, So we have these two systems. We have our adaptive unconscious, and we have our conscious system, and they both exist in us. What's the relationship between these two systems? So how do we know what's going on in our adaptive unconscious? Well, given that we don't have any direct introspection, it's not like we can just look at what's going on and know our feelings and all that, because that's off over in the unconscious, right? We're not Freudians. We don't have a hatch we can open up and see what's going on over there. So what Wilson suggests is what we do is we make it all up. He says that we take advantage of a process called confabulation to be able to make up what's going on in our unconscious. Now, this isn't a new idea, right? I mean, Dennett talks about confabulation. A lot of philosophers have talked about confabulation. But I want to clarify what he means here, because it's a really radical idea. Because it means making it up. So let me give you 3 examples of confabulation. Let me start with hypnotism. So apparently, there's a small percentage of the human population is very open to hypnotism. That you can give post-hypnotic suggestions, and then they'll actually act on those suggestions. So it doesn't affect everyone, but there is a subpopulation where hypnotism can work. And Wilson discusses an experiment they did. He discusses a case involving hypnotism. I'm just going to say what he writes. The operator hypnotizes the subject and tells him that when the cuckoo clock strikes, he will walk up to Mr. White, put a lampshade on his head, kneel on the floor in front of him, and cuckoo 3 times. He has to say cuckoo 3 times. Mr. White was not the type on whom one played practical jokes. In fact, he was a morose, non-humorous sort of individual who would fit very badly in such a picture. Yet, when the cuckoo clock struck, the subject carried out the suggestions to the letter. "What in the world are you doing?" he was asked. "Well, I'll tell you. It sounds queer, but it's just a little experiment in psychology. I've been reading on the psychology of humor, and I thought I'd see how you folks reacted to a joke that was in very bad taste. Please pardon me, Mr. White. No offense intended whatsoever." And the subject sat down without the slightest realization of having acted under post-hypnotic compulsion. So the idea here with confabulation is this guy just made it up, right? He did something, he, noticed they did this thing, and then he had to come up with a good story to explain why he just said cuckoo, 3 times while kneeling with a lampshade. So he just made up a plausible story for why he just did this crazy thing. Second example, split brain patients. So you guys, we've talked about the split brain stuff before. This is Joseph Ledoux is also involved in the split brain studies. But in the split brain studies, just as a reminder, the way it works is they separate the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, usually because of things like epilepsy to prevent it from spreading across the brain, but they split the 2 hemispheres. And then because the hemispheres are actually mapped to opposite eyes for the processing, so then what they do is they set a screen in front of them, and they have a subject look straight out at the screen, and then they'll flash different pictures on the left and the right side, and then it'll be processed by the opposite, sides of the brain. And they did one experiment where what they did is they flashed different pictures on the 2 sides of the screen, and then they asked the subject to point with their left or their right hand to the picture that's the closest to what they're seeing, flashed on the screen. So one of the pictures they flashed is, on one side, they flashed a picture of, let's see, let me make sure I'm getting it right. They flashed a snow scene to the right hemisphere and a chicken claw to the left hemisphere. The patient picked a chicken with his right hand and a shovel with his left hand. That makes sense, right? So see some snow, you pick a shovel. You see a chicken claw, you pick a chicken because that's the closest thing in the cards in front of you. But the interesting thing is, in a split brain patient, the split brain patient only knows half of what's going on in their body, right? Because it turns out that the speech center is located in the left hemisphere. So for that reason, the patient could state very clearly why he picked the chicken. Because he could say, well, I saw a chicken claw. That's why I saw on that side. But he didn't see, have to be careful with language here. The talking conscious self didn't see what was flashed on the other side. He didn't see that, he didn't see the snow flashed on the other side, but he picked the snow shovel. So what the patient said in that case is, I picked the shovel because you need to clean out the chicken shed with a shovel. That was his explanation. because, that's, again, he made it up. He confabulated the whole explanation for why he picked that particular item. There's no sense in which he didn't say, oh, I'm not sure why I did it. It's confusing. He just went directly to, oh, well, of course, because you have to shovel out a chicken sled. Does that make sense? The experiment? Okay. So, final one, Korsakoff syndrome. We've also talked about this. People who have Korsakoff syndrome cannot form memories of new experiences, right? So they can't, if you walk in again after leaving for a half hour, it's like meeting you for the first time over and over and over again. So horrible thing to happen to people. But Wilson discusses a patient who has Korsakoff syndrome who constantly was forced to make up explanations for what was happening to him in the moment. Because, it's like they're thrown into the middle of a scene and they have to get up to speed. They're like impromptu players who always constantly have to figure out what's going on and play along with the events that are happening around them. If you walked into the room, he might decide that you were a customer entering the delicatessen he used to own and would ask whether you want a pastrami or a ham sandwich, but then click, change of scene. He might notice that you're wearing a white coat and would invent a new story. You are the butcher from down the street. Click, new scene. The butcher always had bloodstains on his coat, so you must be a doctor. Mr. Thompson would see no inconsistencies in his changing stories. He came up with perfectly good explanations for his current circumstances, with no ideas that these explanations change from moment to moment. So, Wilson wants to argue that our relationship between our conscious self and our adaptive unconscious is exactly like that relationship between the two hemispheres of a split brain patient. That your conscious self is constantly confabulating, making up stories about what's going on because you don't have any direct access to it. But we just have built into our conscious brain this ability to, go along with, I think I'm doing this because, I need to explain what I'm doing at any moment. So that's his overall thesis. And he supports, yeah.
It sounds a lot like pragmatism.
Oh, because it's useful, or
whatever works.
Whatever works, right? Yeah. I guess so, right? Yeah, you have to go along with what's happening a lot. Yeah. So he also wants to. So he wants to push this idea that we actually have two personalities. That we have two very different personalities. The one that's created by the adaptive unconscious, and the one created by your conscious self. And in fact, he talks about some studies. So there's been personality studies, right? And one of the interesting things about the personality studies is you get two very different results depending on the type of study you perform. So the two basic types of personality studies is, what you can do is you can do a questionnaire survey and have people explicitly self-report on how they would deal with different situations. So you create it's like a multiple choice questionnaire. They go through, they say, yes, in this situation, I would, run out of the room because I'm afraid of being around people or whatever. You go through and you describe your personality and score it on your explicit self-report about what type of personality you have. That's the standard one that everyone here has probably taken at some point in their life for, job interview or high school or whatever. But then there's another type of personality test. It's called the thematic apperception test, the TAP test. And the way they do this is they have these pictures, and they flash these pictures in front of people, and they have to come up with a story that describes what's going on in the picture. And then what psychologists do is they score the story on these different criteria, and they use that to determine the people's personality. Now, why is the TAP test good? Because the TAP test actually gets to people's unconscious personality, because they don't know exactly what's going on there. They see a picture, often ambiguous. We actually spent some time last night going through the pictures on the TAP test. Some of them are really bizarre, but they're kind of freaky, and you have to come up with a little story, and then depending on the themes of your story, they deduce things about your personality from it. So it's a better way of getting to your conscious self. Not surprisingly, it turns out that these two ways of determining people's personality aren't very highly correlated. The way that people explicitly say, what their personality is, isn't very highly correlated with what the TAP test shows. And this has been controversial, apparently, in psychology. But of course, Wilson's explanation of this is that he says, well, they're testing different things. The TAP test is testing your adaptive unconscious. And then the explicit, self-reporting test is testing your conscious self. It's testing what you would say about yourself, which is different from the adaptive unconscious. For example, if Sarah reports on a questionnaire that she has a high need for affiliation, we don't know virtually nothing about the level of this need that she would express non-consciously on the test. They're just not correlated at all. So you might ask, well, which of the two tests are more accurate? Which is really testing to see who you are? Well, it turns out, first off, it depends somewhat on the trait. For example, people tend to agree with others about how extroverted they are. But on most other personality traits, the level of agreement is modest, correlations in the range of 0.40. Thus, Susie's judgment of how agreeable and conscientious she is correlates only modestly with how agreeable and conscientious her friends think she is. So one of the things that they discovered is, first off, your self-report of your personality doesn't correlate very well with your TAT score, but your TAT score actually correlates pretty well with what your friends assess your personality to be, and your friends actually have higher agreement among themselves than you have with your friends. So the idea here is if you really want to know what your personality is like, the last person you should ask is yourself. You should really ask your friends what you're like before you start trying to figure out, by yourself what you're like. Now that's a pretty shocking conclusion, but then what he argues from that is he argues that people put too much weight on the inside information that they think they get from observing their own conscious mental processes, because our relationship with the adaptive unconscious is, not special in any way, not special beyond, we just happen to be, it's along for the ride, so we're around it all the time, but we're not in a better position than outsiders are in understanding our own personality. Okay, so you would think that given that most people's conscious view of their personality is so out of whack with how they're actually like, that you would think that what Wilson would be advocating is that we start, you start listening to your friends, you start getting a better idea of what your personality is actually like, so that you're not, living in Delusionville with this bizarre idea of what your personality actually is. But actually, Wilson doesn't say that. He advocates that you don't spend a lot of time trying to know yourself for two reasons. First, he says a little bit of delusion can be a good thing. Wilson writes that most people believe that they are more popular, talented, attractive, and intelligent than the average person. And this might be necessary for our mental health. So it's actually good to be a little delusional because, you have to, he called it, the psychological immune system. You have to be able to get through the day. So maybe having a perfectly accurate representation of who you are isn't the thing that you should prioritize. But the other reason that he's against people getting a more accurate view of their personality is he claims that we are just incredibly bad at analyzing our unconscious self. And that when people try to do it, they mess it up. And they can actually end up making bad decisions because they're misunderstanding their own personality. And so he gives two experiments for that, which I think are interesting. So let me talk about his two experiments. One thing he did is he had people analyze art posters and decide which ones that they want to take home. So he had some people analyze exactly why they liked or disliked 5 art posters, and some did not. Then all participants chose one of the posters to take home. 2 weeks later, we called people up and asked them how happy they were with the poster that they had chosen. You might predict that the people who analyzed their reasons would make the best choices. By carefully laying out the pros and cons of each option, we found the opposite. The people who did not list reasons and presumably based their choices on their unanalyzed gut feelings were happier with their posters than were the people who listed reasons. So let me restate that. So he gave people, he had 2 groups of people, and both groups of people could make a decision on bring home a poster, the one that they liked. But with one group of people, he actually had them create a list of the pros and cons of each piece of artwork. And the other ones, he just said, go with your gut feeling on the one that you like the most. And then what he did is he did a follow-up and call and see which ones were happier later on the decision they made. And his claim is that if you actually spent the time analyzing which picture you wanted, you came up with a bad decision. You brought home the wrong poster. The people who made the gut feeling, who made the gut decision, were happier later.
I was going to say, I could see myself doing this working in analytics. Just pick
yeah,
don't actually
right, exactly. That's his point. Yeah. Don't overthink it, and he discusses another study which comes to the same conclusion. That's a little more complicated, where he looked at, they did this with college students, and they had the college students analyze their romantic relationships. So this is a little more complex, but we compared people who were asked to list reasons about why their relationship was going the way it was with people who did not list reasons. Whose feelings did the best job of predicting the longevity of the relationship? It was the latter group who did not analyze reasons. This is consistent with the notion that when people analyzed reasons, they constructed stories based on faulty data, such as which aspects of the relationship were easiest to put into words, were on their minds, or were consistent with their theories about how they should feel, leading to attitudes that were less well-informed than those people in the control group who just gave their unanalyzed gut feelings. So his idea here is people tend to rely on faulty cultural theories of human behavior. So folk psychology, right? People rely on a bad theory of human behavior when they list out these reasons, and they think that they come up now after they've carefully analyzed things. They actually now understand the relationship with the, with the romantic partner, but most of the time these guys get it wrong, and then it doesn't end up correlating very well later on against people who just go with their gut feelings. He says this is similar in some ways to, most people have this belief that head colds are caused by going out into cold weather, which of course there's actually no correlation between getting a cold and being out in the cold, even though it's called that. The reason has much more to do with touching your nose and around your eyes and spreading virus around. That's how people get head colds. But we have this standard cultural theory that no, that's the way you get a cold, you better wear a jacket when you step outside. That would lead us to do things that aren't the best thing to do, but it's just so culturally embedded that that's the way we approach the world. All right, so let me summarize. So the point of this talk was to get some more insight into who we are, right? The point was, so who are you? Well, the takeaway from T.D. Wilson is that we're the small bit of our brain that is conscious, the little teeny snowball at the top of this iceberg of unconsciousness. And you might ask yourself, well, why does this bit of brain need to exist at all? After all, it seems like the majority of brain processing gets along just fine without the conscious part. Or another way of asking this question, going back to the talk on roundworms, is why do we assume that thermostats and roundworms are not conscious and dogs and humans are conscious? I mean, why do we have this extra thing in our brain called consciousness when presumably simpler organisms like roundworms don't? So he argues that one important aspect of consciousness is to construct narratives about ourselves. Our conscious self is constantly engaged in analyzing events that happen to us and weaving these events into one or more life narratives. Consciousness constructs a personal identity that exists over time. He writes, in essence, we must be like biographers of our own lives, distilling our behavior and feelings into a meaningful and effective narrative. So what makes us different from roundworms is that we have a sense of self that persists over time that's being constructed by our conscious self. So let me stop here and we will discuss.